welcome to Beyond Sunday, and glad you could join us. With me is Adrian Tsingaris. Did I mispronounce your last name?
Everyone gets it wrong.
And Diane Rutledge.
Hello.
Our Walnut Creek campus pastor and Brentwood campus pastor. Glad you could join us.
Yeah.
Thanks
So
for having
you
me.
each were able to preach live. You in Walnut Creek, Adrian, and Diane, you in Brentwood. Ingold preached in Livermore this weekend, and he's had enough time on Beyond Sunday, so he needs a break.
That's
He's
good.
on timeout, Beyond Sunday timeout. No, but I'm excited to unpack your messages a little bit more and this text. There's so much in the second half of Philippians chapter 1. You guys did an amazing job. I mean, the theme that we had at every campus that was all tied together was the whole idea of our suffering, the chains, the hard times we go through is the things that God often uses in the most powerful ways to advance the gospel.
Right.
If we let him.
Right.
But that's not easy.
No.
And so I appreciate how the sensitivity with which you guys approached that topic, but also encouraged us and challenged us to think about what are those moments that have been really hard for us. Some of us are going through those moments now.
Yeah.
Others of us, we are looking back at those hard times and thinking about, okay, how is that still being effective in terms of God is using that hard time for me to do ministry?
And I think it's easier to have hindsight about your difficult circumstances. You can look back on your suffering and then see God moving, and you have victory over it now, or perhaps you're far enough past it that it's not as painful. So I think it's really hard to have a heavenly perspective when you're in the middle of your circumstance, right? And I think that was really what I wanted to lean into this weekend, was that idea that right now in your current circumstance, God is doing something and it's serving a purpose, that it's not in vain. And so that was really important for me because that helped me
And
a
it was
lot.
true to the text because Paul was
Right.
experiencing that joy in the middle of the suffering. It wasn't 2 years later when he was referencing back.
Right.
And that's the beautiful thing about it, is that pain is the great unifier.
Yeah.
Nobody goes through life without feeling pain, feeling trapped, and being in a situation that they can't wait to look back on, to get through. But if we can, in the midst of that, recognize that how we endure, how we process through that can bring us closer to Christ, but also, like the text says, give confidence to those around us, then that unity that we have with the whole world allows other people to look in and say, wait, how come I don't go through my pain like that? How come my pain just sucks and doesn't encourage other people and isn't encouraging to me? But for people who know Jesus, we can look back, like you're saying, and say, man, I didn't like it, I don't want to go back there, but man, I may not want to change that or trade it because I'm a different person, I'm closer to Jesus, or I'm healthier because of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I that's obviously true for me as well. The darkest times in my life, the most difficult times in life, are the times where I grew the most. I was challenged the most, I stretched, and I became my faith grew, and there was things about me that needed to die. And if it wasn't for suffering is one of the greatest tools God uses as part of the sanctification process to grow us. And I love how Paul in where are we? Verse 27 of chapter 1, he says, whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. And just the way his tone is throughout this chapter, and then you combine that with him saying, whatever happens, he's at a point in his life where there's almost like let me say it another way. I think most of us get surprised when the hard times come, and it takes us even a while to get over the shock of, I can't believe that God would let this stupid, and you can throw cuss words in because usually that's what you want to say in those times of your life.
Right.
That, like, we can't even get past that part of the process because we had a different plan. We envision life going a different way, and it's just like that's just too big of a stumbling block for us to even get out of the negative thoughts of the reality of this is even happening to me. Whereas when I read Paul, he's like, whatever happens, and there's almost like an expectation of, a bunch of junk's gonna happen, but whatever happens, here's what we're gonna do.
Right.
Well, it's like Peter writes, or is it James? It says, hey, do not be surprised, brothers, when the junk hits the fan. He's like, don't be surprised. That's what happens in life. But be prepared for it and know how you're going to process through it. And I think that's where Paul is. Paul's at the point where he's like, I've seen enough stuff. I've been beaten enough times. I've been thrown in jail. And I've got this long list of bad stuff that's happened that I'm not surprised by it. Mm-hmm. It's almost like he's looking forward, like, what's the next
It's
thing?
not a bunch of bad stuff's going to happen pessimism.
Mm-hmm.
No.
Like, there's a depth of hopefulness to what we were referencing earlier of, like, I know that when I go through a hard time, something incredible is going to come out of that. And so I'm not, like, a masochist where I'm, like, eager for hard things to happen and hurt me.
Right.
But I know it. So Sean and I have talked about this in our marriage. We had, just recently, we had conflict and a fight, and she was just being terrible, and I had to confront her. No, just kidding.
Oh yeah, I'm so sure.
Shauna, we don't believe that.
No, not at all.
No, we had conflict, and what usually happens is it leads to a season of deeper connection after you work through it. And we actually, in the middle of the connection that came after, for sometimes that last weeks where you just like reached another level, we actually had the comment of like, a part of me looks forward to our next conflict because I know we're going to be able to take another step forward, even though there's recognition of the conflict sucks.
Yeah.
And in the moment, we don't want it. But when
That's
you
such a
have
good
that
perspective.
hindsight viewpoint, it's like, actually, okay, bring it on because I'm excited about what can come out of that.
Right. And the intimacy with God that comes through that. And that's the assurance that Paul had, right? He's like, with every step of suffering that I've had this deeper connection with God, which is why he can sound a little bit cavalier in this.
Yeah.
Right?
That's a great word, cavalier, because the word I was thinking of is it's almost like he's a little flippant.
Yeah.
Like, hey, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't even know what I'm going to choose, if I'm going to stay or if I'm going to go with Jesus.
Right.
It's cavalier almost. Like, hey, I know who's in charge, so I don't have to be bogged down by details.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's my story with Jesus. With every trial that I've walked through, I had an opportunity to either distance myself from God or to press into God and to gain a deeper understanding of trusting him and the depth of his care for me despite my circumstances. And so I think that that's actually what Paul was experiencing. He was like, okay, another trial is going to come and I get to see a whole new aspect of who God is and his faithfulness and his goodness through that trial. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned intimacy, and I think the big thing is when we go through these challenging times, when we go through suffering, if we can recognize that God is in control, and if God chose to remove the suffering from us, he absolutely has the power and the ability to do it. But if he chooses not to, we have to ask, is God still loving?
Right.
Does he still love me? And if he does, how do I go through this process differently? And when you read Paul, you feel like, man, he's come to some real healthy conclusions about that. He's still saying, hey, God is going to be honored. I know that he loves me, and I can't wait to go be with him. I just don't know if that's going to be today or some other time.
Right.
And it's a different perspective than I have when I go through suffering. But the relationship aspect of looking at it like, you and Shauna in a marriage relationship, if we can process it in that very personal, relational way with Jesus, saying, Jesus, I don't know what you're doing, but I still know you love me. In the same way that if Tanya and I are in a fight, I might say, Tanya, I don't know what you're doing, but I know you're on my team, so I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt, or I'm willing to follow your lead on this. It's much healthier when we look at it in that relational aspect and realize, man, the one who loves us most and knows us best is the one who's allowed Paul to be in chains in Rome, and that affected the way he went through all that.
Yeah, for sure. We skipped over a little bit the fact that Paul talks about how some people preach out of really bad motivations, out of self-interest, and he's not too worried about it. I that's, for me, that's fascinating. I don't know what application really to draw to that.
For me, it's frustrating because I wish I could be like, for me, it's just like, I get angry.
Yeah.
And I think some of it is personal, but some of it also is there's this weird defensiveness on behalf of Jesus, as if Jesus needs me to defend him and say, that person shouldn't be teaching, or that person shouldn't be teaching that. And you look at Paul, much more mature than I, saying like, who cares? If people are talking about Jesus, if people are moving incrementally towards Jesus, that's great.
Yeah.
That's fine.
There was this pastor that I went to a church in New Zealand when I was living over there, and he was doing some crazy things that I just wasn't familiar with, and it just felt fake to me. And so I remember sitting in the back of the room, just observing the room and being like, there's some weird stuff happening here. And so in my spirit, I discerned it as false teaching, just like this isn't accurate. And a friend went forward and she prayed for healing, and he laid his hands on her and slayed her and prayed for her. And she walked away from that experience healed. and she had had severe allergies her whole life. And I remember coming home from that and talking with one of our pastors on staff, and I was explaining to him what happened. He said, nothing will rock our faith more, or theology more, than when God moves through bad teaching. And it's what Paul's saying in this context. He's like, if Christ is preached, then Christ is preached. And God and the Spirit of God is going to work through that. And so it's very humbling, too, to know that even us as teachers, we don't have all the answers. And so when people look to us, it's like God and the Holy Spirit are in charge of this.
For sure.
So it's a very releasing thing. But, yeah, I mean, I get frustrated, too.
People in Walnut Creek grew closer to Christ this weekend.
Well,
you know what I mean? Like, it can still happen. It can still happen. Just kidding.
Oh, I love it.
Just kidding. No, I mean, Paul's just his. I feel like this is later Paul.
Yeah.
I feel like other letters he's written, he's not as casual.
Right.
Like before Rome, Paul.
Right.
yeah.
He's closer to the end. He's not as some of the other letters he wrote. He's way more aggressive in terms of there's a false teacher.
Yeah.
I'm going after them. So you could almost see like.
And he had the freedom to go after them, too, because he wasn't in chains. So he actually could kind of do a little bit more legwork in that.
I feel like he could from Rome, though, too. Like, if he wanted to just rip all those people, he totally could have in his letter.
Yeah, he could have dropped some names saying, hey, this guy's teaching in selfish ambition. Go make him stop.
Which people in your life have been false teachers? You want to name some?
That's not a fun conversation
Okay.
to have.
Okay. Another question I have or thought is just the phrase of to die is gain and to live is Christ. Like, what do you make of that? It's almost, that's a famous phrase, but it's actually weird when you think about it.
It's interesting because you said earlier that there were some things in you going through the hard times that had to die. And when you said that, I immediately connected to that phrase. For me to live is Christ and to die is gain. And I wonder if, we're talking about Paul going through a pretty rough time. And I wonder if he's looking at it from the same perspective, saying like, hey, there needs to be some death. You know, like John the Baptist says, I must decrease, you must increase. And I wonder if that statement is a little bit about like, hey, life and all the beauty and growth and health that comes from life is Jesus. And he's saying, I need more of that. And death is, I get to be with him. But the life part is the beauty of like becoming more like him.
Yeah, I really like that idea of, he's speaking about it literally, but if we think about it metaphorically, where it's this idea of us dying, that's part of our resurrection in Christ on this side of eternity, right? We don't actually die, but parts of us do die. And so that's really cool to think about how Christ is crucifying the flesh still, even while we're alive. You know, I don't know.
Well, Jesus referred to himself as life.
Yeah.
Like he is life. And so he's taking us outside of just his human limitations, and he's referring to himself in all the fullness of who he is, and referring to himself as God and as life. And so oftentimes I think we limit Jesus in the sense of we think of him as in 3 years that he was here in a human body, and kind of limit him sometimes to that, and sometimes forget the breadth and like the mind-blowing bigness of who he is, life itself.
Right.
And Paul staying on earth is he's staying in like this life that's here on earth, but it's almost like the same is true. Like there's not that as much distinction between life. Like he's still in Christ either way. Like he's fully living life, whether he stays or goes.
Well, there's the big, of what you're saying, but there's also the really small, like practical of, for him to live is to emulate Jesus, is to live the life pattern of Christ, of serving and loving and caring for others, which is what he says, like, hey, that's what's pushing me to want to be here longer. But if it was just up to me, I want to go to the party that's in heaven with Jesus.
I want to go to that too. I'm on board.
I don't know about that.
Verdict's still out.
The verdict is still out.
If I'm going to make it, yeah.
I'll put in a good word
true.
for you.
Yeah.
Right.
You'll be my +1. But that's amazing that it's the broadness of all of creation, all of life, but it's also the very specifics of how do I live 5 minutes from now and emulate Christ, live in that pattern to demonstrate who he is, to become him, to be conformed to his image.
And his motivation for staying was because he knew that his purpose wasn't finished, right? Like there was still people that he needed to serve and encourage. And I think that that is something that we can kind of take on as a takeaway. Like we know we want to emulate Christ in all of our actions. And so while we're living, like to live as Christ, but our purpose in that is to care for other people and to encourage other people, and that our life has significance and value no matter what our circumstances are. And so I think that that was Paul's big takeaway from this for the Philippian church was, hey, like I'm still prospering in my mission here, even though I'm in chains. And so I'm going to stay here and I'm going to remain here with you because of that.
Well, and it sounds like he has, where he says, I don't know what I'm going to do. It almost sounds like he is, we were talking about, it feels like he's so close to Jesus that if he were to say, Jesus, just take me now, Jesus would be like, all right. Okay. But he also recognizes when the work isn't done. And I was thinking about this older woman. I knew this woman who was a missionary in Africa that came back to the United States, and she was in a care facility, and she couldn't get out of bed. So I knew her for 4 years and would go visit her. And she would always pray for all the pastors on staff, and she would pray for anyone who was in need. And I would visit her, and we would pray, and she was this incredible prayer warrior. And I remember going to visit her, and her health had not changed at all, but she said, I think I'm going to go home soon. And I said, well, what's the matter? She goes, nothing's the matter, but I think my time is done. And I said, no, you're going to be fine, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to see you in a week. And within 3 days, she passed away.
Wow.
But I think with that intimacy with Jesus, at a certain point, like you're saying, when your mission's completed. And she knew, okay, my time is done. I'm ready to go home. I'm ready to go to the party. And I think, man, I would love to know and have that peace. She was like excited about it. It wasn't like she was in mourning. She was like, all right, I've been stuck in this bed for long enough. And Jesus is now saying, it's up to you. And she's going, okay, if I get to vote, I'm going there.
That's beautiful.
It was cool.
That was really cool. Anything else that you read in the text that you were assigned and really didn't get to touch on as much, that was hard to skip over? Because it's hard. I mean, in the 30-minute message, there's so many good verses.
There's
here.
a lot. I feel like, my congregation might feel differently, but I feel like I was able to cover a lot of it. I mean, that's a lot of verses to cover, and there's so many different points. But my favorite piece of this was that our story encourages someone else. And I think that was just my biggest takeaway personally from this section, is knowing that when we share our burdens with each other, you don't have to keep it to yourself. You don't have to keep your suffering isolated. The enemy would love nothing more than to tell us, like, you're the only one going through this. If people find out what you're struggling with, they're going to be ashamed of you. You have reason to be ashamed. And so, but the truth is that when we share what we're going through, all of a sudden we become encouraged ourselves, and the people who we're sharing with become encouraged. And then together our faith becomes bolder. And so I think that was my favorite part that I didn't really get to lean into. I think that a lot of times when we're suffering, we want to isolate ourselves. So press into community.
Yeah. I think that's important. Normally we run from others and from Jesus when we struggle. And the opposite is what we're called to do.
Right.
I think to answer your question, the thing that we didn't get into is Paul has this statement where he drops and says, I hope and expect that I won't be ashamed by how he goes through this. And it's, for me, it's easy to jump to, well, he would be ashamed if he denied his faith, or if he whimpered while he was getting his monthly beating or whatever, or complained. But I don't think in the context of what we read that that's what he's thinking about, what would cause him to be ashamed. I think the absence of inspiring others, I think the absence of the kingdom expanding is what he's talking about. I think he's saying, I hope and expect that I won't be ashamed, because the kingdom of God is going to continue to progress while I'm suffering, in the midst of, because of how I go through this suffering. And that's really interesting to me to think about. Like, when I'm in pain, I'm not thinking about how I'm going to be ashamed if others don't see Jesus in it. I'm just thinking of, I just want this to get through, and I don't want to be embarrassed by whether I'm, complaining too much or whatever. And I think that it's another level that really comes from Paul being so connected to Jesus and being able to remind himself of the good news while he's in prison and the good things that are happening around him.
Yeah.
That's great. I love it. Well, thank you guys for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
And great job this weekend.
Thank you.
And we're going to continue on as we head into chapter 2 of Philippians next week. And thanks for joining us. We'll talk to you later.